So I thought I was gonna make a little bit of a different video this week, just because the next couple weeks will be all about Paul's letters to the different churches. So why not just make a video about Paul, talking about his background and where does he come from, what influences his way of thinking and all of that sort of stuff. So this video is about the Apostle Paul. So the Apostle Paul, probably best known from the Bible, is one of the thinkers that may have influenced the Western world the most. And even though he lived 2,000 years ago, if you're a Christian, there's no doubt that this man has influenced your life. So he wrote 13 letters of the New Testament, and he planted a bunch of churches, and he's probably one of the most quoted guys in history. So who is this guy? And what was so special about him? So if you read the Bible, you'll notice that Paul is not mentioned in any of the Gospels. There's no record of him ever meeting Jesus. And the first time we hear about him is when he's approving for the stoning of Stephen, one of the leading Christians. And our first image of Paul is that he is persecuting the church and trying to stop the Christians as best as he could. But how did he end up this way? We don't know too many details about Paul's early life, but we do know some things. He was born and raised in a town called Tarsus, one of the leading cities in the empire for education and philosophy. There were three great universities in the Roman Empire, one being in Athens, one being in Alexandria, and the last one in Tarsus. A historian called Strabo, writing around 19 AD, wrote that Tarsus's enthusiasm for learning, and especially for philosophy, surpasses Athens and Alexandria and every other university town. This love for learning and philosophy no doubt have great influence on Paul. Probably the biggest influence on Paul, however, is that he grew up in a family of Pharisees. The Pharisees were a Jewish sect that saw it as their mission to preserve the Jewish people from contamination. They would study the law of Moses from a young age, and they would actually make extra laws just so that they wouldn't break the actual law. In the Pharisees' mind, a Messiah or a Savior would come and lead the Jewish people into holiness and free them from the rulers and establish Israel as a great nation again and taking his throne as king in the line of David. And after that, God would return to the temple and everything would be as in the good old days of King David. This was no doubt also Paul's mindset, and maybe also why Paul was so opposed to Jesus as the Messiah, the guy who died on a cross. He and his family was tent makers by trade, and he probably learned this skill early on in his life, before he was sent off to Jerusalem to study under a rabbi called Gamaliel. Gamaliel was probably the leader of the Sanhedrin, or the Jewish council, and he is regarded in the Jewish Talmud as one of the greatest teachers in Judaism, saying that since Rabbi Gamaliel the Elder died, there has been no more reverence for the law, and purity and piety died out at the same time. So Paul was taught by one of the greatest teachers in Jewish history and had a deep understanding of Jewish scriptures. After he was done studying under Gamaliel, we don't really know what Paul did. He may have stayed in Jerusalem, or he may have gone back to his hometown in Tarsus. So the first time we read about him in the Bible, he is approving of the execution of Stephen in Acts chapter 7. Stephen is brought to the Sanhedrin where he has his defense speech, and the people get so mad at him that they drag him out of the city and stone him. And Paul approved of this stoning. This would probably mean that Paul was in the Sanhedrin, and also that he probably had some authority in the Sanhedrin. The only problem with that is that if you were to be in the Sanhedrin, you had to have a wife. But it is clear from the first letter to the Corinthians that he did not have a wife. So some people believe that he had a wife and she died, or some people just believe that he wasn't actually in the Sanhedrin. Or that he was so exceptional that they let him be in the Sanhedrin without a wife. Another thing that we know about Paul is that he was from birth a Roman citizen. Only 5 million of the 50 million people living in the Roman Empire were citizens, and being a citizen had many benefits. If you weren't a citizen, you wouldn't be fully protected by the Roman law. So for instance, if you were murdered, the Roman authorities wouldn't investigate your murder. But if you were a citizen, they would. Non-citizens' marriages was not recognized by the Roman authorities, but if you were a citizen, it was. A Roman citizen would not be punished without a trial, And if they wouldn't want to be tried by the local authorities, they could always appeal to Rome. When Paul was in Philippi, he was put into prison without a trial, and when the Roman authorities found out that he was a Roman citizen, they got afraid because they knew that they did not have that right to put him into prison. Also, when Paul is in Jerusalem, they want to punish him, but when he tells them that he is a Roman citizen, they have to give him a trial first. In this trial, he also uses his right as a Roman citizen to appeal to Rome. Roman citizens were also exempt from the most torturous ways of executions, like crucifixion, and we know that Paul was beheaded. The different ways of acquiring citizenships was either that you would be born into it, so if your father was a citizen, you would also be a citizen, or you could be granted it by Roman authorities. And sometimes when they wanted to make a little bit extra money, they would also sell Roman citizenships to people. We know that Paul was a citizen from birth, but we have no idea how his father or grandfather acquired his citizenship. So let's get into the story of Paul that we find in the Bible. The places in the Bible where you can find the story about Paul is in Acts and in Galatians. The first time we meet him, he is known as Saul. Later, this will change to Paul. Not that he changed his name, Saul is his Jewish name and Paul is his Greek name. And it would make sense that if he is traveling around in the Roman Empire, he would use his Greek name. Paul is on his way to Damascus to capture the Christians there, but on the way he is met by a great light that blinds him. This is when he meets Jesus, and Jesus asks him, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" And from then on, his life is changed. This is commonly referred to as the conversion of Paul, but the most accurate statement for this would be a further revelation for Paul. He didn't stop believing what he was taught as a child from the law of Moses, but he had to interpret the whole thing through the lens of Jesus. So Paul goes into Damascus without sight, and there he meets a disciple called Ananias that tells him that he is supposed to preach to the Gentiles, and then he gets his sight back. Then he goes to Arabia and stays there for 3 years. What he does in Arabia isn't really clear. Some say that he went there to preach about Jesus, but I feel like going into the desert to preach where there's not that many people isn't really Paul's strategy. Paul usually went to the bigger cities in the empire where there were a lot of Jews. I believe that this journey to Arabia is more just Paul trying to get away from everyone so that he can just figure this Jesus thing out as best as he can by himself. Then he moves on to Damascus and then to Jerusalem for a short amount of time before he goes home to his home city, Tarsus, and stays there for 10 years. When you read Acts, it seems like Paul just starts preaching about Jesus right away after he meets Jesus. But in reality, when you look at the timeline, it seems that he took a lot of time trying to figure this stuff out. Looking at Paul's life, I'm not so sure I would actually like to be his friend. Wherever he goes, it seems like he either is thrown out of the city, or he's thrown into prison, or there's a riot because of him. And you could say that this is just persecution because of his faith, but it seems like this happens more to him than any of the other Christians. Just look at Acts chapter 9. Paul is only in Jerusalem 3 weeks, but in those 3 weeks he manages to get someone to try to kill him. And look at what it says. And when the brothers learned this, they brought him down to Caesarea and sent him off to Tarsus. So the church throughout all Judea and Galilee and Samaria had peace and was being built up. So after Paul leaves, it seems like the church has peace. So it seems like Paul had a habit of getting into trouble. After Paul has been in Tarsus for 10 years, Barnabas went to get him to help out the church in Antioch. Then after a little while, they go out on their journeys. I won't go through these journeys in this video just because I did it in my previous video about Acts, so just check that out in one of these corners. One thing I will mention though is that when he went to a city, he always went to the synagogue as long as there was one in the city. This might be confusing when we think about how he had a mission to bring the gospel to the Gentiles. But I think there is a bit of a misunderstanding here. We think of Paul's missionary journeys as like our missionary journeys to Papua New Guinea or something, to tell people that don't believe in God about God. This was not really the mission of Paul though. He went into the synagogue and told them that the Messiah they have been waiting for has come. But wait, how is that going to the Gentiles? In the synagogue, there weren't only born Jews. There were also God-fearers and proselytes. That is, people that for some reason had started believing that the God of the Jews was the real God. This caused a hierarchy in the synagogue where the Jewish men were on top and pretty much everyone that wasn't a Jewish man was on the bottom. So when Paul comes into the synagogue and tells them that the Messiah has come and now there's no difference between Jew and Gentile, of course that will appeal more to Gentiles than to Jews. So many Gentiles started following what he taught, and some Jews. Other Jews got really mad at this message. We see this especially clearly when Paul is in Corinth. Paul gets so upset with the Jews that he says that, "I'm done with you, I'll go to the Gentiles from now on." So he leaves the synagogue and goes to the neighbor of the synagogue and just keeps teaching the Gentiles there. Then Paul has 3 missionary journeys and 1 extra journey from Jerusalem to Rome after he is taken captive. And he ends up a prisoner awaiting for trial in Rome. This is where our knowledge about Paul stops. We know that this imprisonment wasn't really that bad. He gets to stay in his own house in like a house arrest, and his friends gets to come and visit him whenever they want to. This is around 62 AD and he doesn't die until 67 AD, so he probably was released from prison at some point. But we don't really know what he did in this period. Some people believe that he got as far as Spain before he was taken back to Rome where he was beheaded. But as I said, we don't really know. So that is the story about Paul. He was a super intelligent guy, a super passionate guy, probably not the guy I would want to be best friends with, but still probably one of the most influential guys in history. And that is where I'm gonna end this video. I hope you enjoyed it and that you learned something about Paul. If you're interested in more about him, I would recommend that you read Paul, a biography by N.T. Wright. N.T. Wright is probably the one person in the world that knows the most about Paul, so yeah, he knows exactly what he is talking about. Anyway, thank you so much for watching this video. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already. You can also support me on Patreon. Link to that is in the description down below. Bye bye.